Dear delegates and friends, it's a real honor for me to be able to address you all on this very important conference for the LDAC. Unfortunately, I cannot attend myself, and that is due to the current refugee crisis that is here in Europe, and I can assure you this is really taking a lot of energy and effort now for the Swedish government, and that is the reason I can't be with you all. But I think that's also a very good starting point to address you on the issue of the external dimension of the EU common fisheries policy. Not many years ago, we saw a stream of pirogues, of small fishing boats, going from the West African coast to the Canary Islands, with fishermen that saw no other opportunity for their livelihoods than to seek another life in Europe because of the extensive overfishing in West Africa. Some of it due to European boats, other foreign fleets. And this was one of the reasons that we saw in the European Union it necessary to reform the EU common fisheries policy and its external dimension with the fishing agreements with third world countries to make them more responsible and sustainable. Because we're all interconnected today, and we can't have a reality where European politics contribute to something that is unsustainable, where the poor people in the world cannot really provide for themselves because of something that the European Union is doing. So now I used to be in the European Parliament and responsible for the report on the external dimension of the common fisheries policy, and we made good progress on that. Now I am a development cooperation minister of Sweden, and I think it would be also appropriate to mention a recent FAO report on the value of African fisheries in this context. And FAO states that 25% of all catches made around the African coast now is made by foreign fleets. But the value of those catches, if made by African fleets, would actually add up to 3.3 billion US dollars, 3.3 billion US dollars. That's 8 times the amount that the African states are earning through the foreign fisheries agreements. And 3.3 billion is actually the same amount that Sweden is providing through development cooperation aid annually. And we're one of the biggest providers of development cooperation aid, so that really is a big amount. And that shows the importance of actually strengthening local capacity in Africa, strengthening both the possibility of managing and surveilling and monitoring African fisheries to provide local livelihoods. So I'm just going to mention the major new elements that came into European legislation in 2013 that is important for the EU fisheries agreements. And for the first time, we have these principles in legislation. And before 2013, it was only in the Council conclusions, but now it's actually provided for in law. And the first and most important principle is the one on only negotiating for access to a surplus of fish stocks that the third country doesn't need for its own local population or for its own food safety, food security. And this is a very, very important principle. It's also enshrined in the UN Law of the Seas, and this is something that needs to be respected by all the foreign fleets everywhere. And just in addition to that, it's also important, if you read the UN Law of the Seas, Articles 69 and 70, it also says that the rights of the people in landlocked countries or in geographically disadvantaged countries, they also have the right to access to the marine protein and the fish resources in the neighboring countries. So we must respect that as an advanced union of countries, the EU. The second principle that was very important was the decoupling of sectoral support from the access to fishing opportunities. Before it was a mixture when EU paid large amounts of money, and it was not clear how much of the money was paid for supporting the local fisheries sector and monitoring, surveillance and science, and how much was for the actual fishing opportunities. Now we have a clear-cut separation between the two, which makes it much more easy to see how much we're paying for access for the fishing, and also that the fishing sector itself should pay a much bigger part of that access money. The third element that was enshrined in the new law was that the same rules should apply for EU operators inside and outside of the European Union, irrespective of where they're operating. Another very important element was the human rights issue, that all the new agreements should have a human rights clause included. And this is, of course, only natural, but it's good that it's in the legislation. And another very important element was that we need to see evaluations of former agreements, and that the European Parliament and the Council should have access to these evaluations in good time before approving a new fisheries agreement. And this is something that is important for the transparency of these agreements, and making sure that it's really only a surplus of fish that we're negotiating for. And lastly, the exclusivity clause, that if we have an agreement with a country, then all the EU operators should be operating under that agreement, not doing private agreements. And talking about private agreements, this is of course a very large sector where only some of the boats are operating under these formal agreements. And we tried in the new common fisheries policy to also provide some mentioning of the private sector's agreements, and that member states must make efforts to monitor activities of all union vessels, and that all union vessels must provide data on their activities. So I think this is really the next step to make much more efforts of monitoring what's actually going on in the oceans. And we also made some improvements on the use of abusive reflagging. So there's also a paragraph saying that this must be stopped. So these were major achievements, and I must say in the European Parliament and in the Council there was almost complete consensus on these improvements. I also like to say that the European Parliament on a number of occasions showed that it's really serious on making these improvements true. The Parliament stopped 2 agreements, one with Guinea and the other with Morocco for different reasons, but because they didn't live up to these standards. And we think that the EU has now set a standard that should be followed by other foreign fishing fleets and by the coastal countries themselves, an opportunity to put the same pressure on other foreign fleets that are negotiating for agreements. We don't want to be part of a race to the bottom where lower and lower standards are applied because others don't respect these principles. But we want to see a race to the top where the EU sets an example and coastal states can also convince other foreign fleets to follow the same principles. And that's the only way to really have sustainable fisheries and oceans that are alive, and the possibilities for livelihoods for millions and millions and millions of people in Africa that have no other possibility for their livelihoods than living out of what the ocean can provide. Lastly, in 2 weeks' time, the UN is going to adopt a set of new global sustainable development goals. 17 of them, and the 14th goal is the goal of sustainable usage of the oceans. And Sweden is really going to take the lead on the implementation of this goal. We see it as extremely important. We see it also as very important to partner with developing countries to strengthen the capacity to really monitor and making sure that this goal will be achieved within the next 15 years. We're willing to partner on the fight against illegal fisheries, on sustainable management, and we see a common responsibility on these issues as really core. And I can see that this conference could be one first important step for making the African fisheries really sustainable. The Swedish ambassador of the oceans, Lisa Emilia Svensson, she will be attending the conference. She will follow it closely. I know my colleagues, former colleagues from the European Parliament are there and following very closely as well. And I'm confident that you will have a very successful conference. Thank you so much for listening to me and for inviting me to speak and have a fruitful discussion. Thank you, and see you later.